How do you convince white people?
He has no competition in the Democratic Party.
This should be a solvable problem, but it's not because the drug is too expensive.
Five years after Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 crashed in Ukraine, and a year after an international investigation found a Russian missile brought it down, prosecutors are charging 3 Russians and a Ukrainian for the murder of the 298 people on board. But they don't know where the Ukrainian suspect is, and Russia, which insisted had nothing to do with the crash, could refuse to extradite the other 3. The former coal lobbyist now running the EPA announced regulations to replace President Obama's 2015 Clean Power Plan. If the Trump administration's Affordable Clean Energy Rule gets through a gauntlet of lawsuits, it would effectively mean that states no longer have to reduce carbon emissions at their power plants. And a study shows that under the new plan, 28% of coal-fired plants would actually increase their emissions. A federal jury found Keith Raniere, the leader of the sex cult NXIVM, guilty on all counts, including sex trafficking and racketeering. Some of the 16,000 members of what Raniere had sold as a self-help group testified that they were coerced into being branded with his initials and kept on near-starvation diets. The defense didn't call any of its own witnesses, claiming instead that, quote, disgusting ideas aren't criminal. Former White House Communications Director Hope Hicks appeared in a closed-door meeting of the House Judiciary Committee, but refused to answer most questions. Only, unlike other former Trump staffers, she didn't cite executive privilege. Instead, Hicks leaned on an untested theory that senior staffers are, quote, absolutely immune from having to testify.
It's not a thing. The Department of Justice simply made this concept up. It doesn't exist. They're going to lose in court.
This was the scene on Capitol Hill today, not for a historic vote or high-profile confirmation showdown, but for a hearing.
Get into the room as soon as possible.
On a bill that would form a commission to study the idea of something that Congress or the country has never taken this seriously: reparations.
We need to clear the hallway at this time.
This body has a chance to both make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair-weather patriotism. To say that a nation is both its credits and its debits. That if Thomas Jefferson matters, so does Sally Hemings. That if D-Day matters, so does Black Wall Street.
Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2014 essay forced reparations into the national conversation. But the idea has been around since slavery ended. In every Congress from 1989 until his retirement in 2017, Congressman John Conyers introduced the bill to study the idea. He designated it as H.R. 40, after the original attempt to compensate African Americans who had been held in slavery. 40 acres and a mule. Conyers' bill never got much traction, but Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee reintroduced it after his retirement.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that I may hereafter be considered as the primary sponsor of H.R. 40.
Let's talk about reparations.
Its time is now. I don't think there could ever be a moment in history where both the timing and the factors are so ripe for reconciliation and understanding, and really a constructive conversation about the original sin, slavery, and the brutality of slavery.
Naysayers, it's a lot of them. and they're saying a lot of nays. And one of the nays is, Congresswoman, you wasn't no slave. Ain't nobody living now engaged. They didn't engage in slavery. They weren't held in slavery. So why should I give someone money for something that, one, that I shouldn't be held responsible for doing, right?
We're not focusing on payments, but we are saying that the government has to respond to its actions. Mm-hmm. We want to establish this commission and to get to the bottom line of the de jure and de facto impact of slavery. So what does that mean? Why are we in such high numbers of mass incarceration? Is that a long-standing impact of slavery? And lastly, though not the end, why is it that we can all have pain when we go into inner cities and it relates to our schools that our children are in? I would hope we could find our answers in this commission.
Do you think it's going to happen, this commission?
I am an eternal optimist, but more importantly, I got a lot of folk on the ground.
So how do you convince white people that this is a good idea when it's not their problem?
You count yourself as being part of the great America, the country that is counted as an experiment that the world looks to with great admiration, adhering to the rule of law, Constitution, then do you want to show this to the world as well?
Mm-hmm. The topic of reparations is popular these days. Black senators running for president are talking about it.
Not only do I support it, but I have legislation that actually does it.
We've got to recognize, back to that earlier point, people aren't starting out on the same base.
And white senators running for president are talking about it.
America was founded on principles of liberty and freedom and on the backs of slave labor.
We're going to do everything we can to put resources into distressed communities and improve lives for those people who have been hurt from the legacy of slavery.
Some people around D.C. are willing to engage the conversation too, but how to actually right the wrongs of hundreds of years of oppression can be overwhelming.
So I'm definitely for it, but I'm not so sure about how it'll be able to come about, deciding who's descendants of U.S. slaves. So I think it could be a little tricky, but I'm all for it.
So then you'd be willing to foot some of the bill for it through tax dollars?
Absolutely. I mean, look at our tax dollars going into military defense spending, and I'm not for that. So I'd be happy to be a part of a movement where you're helping pay reparations for people who literally built this country on their ancestors' backs against force of their will. So absolutely.
Do you think it's possible to monetize human suffering?
It's been done in the past with victims of, conflict, war, criminal cases. So yeah, I think it's been done, but not just to this degree.
So do you think it's actually possible for reparations to happen?
I mean, look at Israel right now. Like after World War II, Jewish people got the state of Israel as like a safe space for them. But here as Black Americans, we're still in the same place where we were slaves a couple hundred years ago, and we haven't gotten, similar benefits. So it's definitely possible.
So you really think there are enough white folks that will vote for reparations in a way that we would get it in the form that you think is sufficient?
To be quite honest, even being optimistic, no, not right now.
Although the idea of reparations may seem like an almost impossible task, for the people here today, this hearing and the scene it caused in Washington felt something like progress.
My impression was progress. I think the last reparations hearing was 12 years ago. I think even on the Democratic side, it was quite clear that a number of Congress members took the issue quite seriously. So we'll see where we go from there.
With every ounce of heart and might and sweat and soul, we're going to keep making America great again. And that is why tonight I stand before you to officially launch my campaign for a second term as President of the United States.
Yesterday here in Orlando, President Trump gave his fans exactly what they've been waiting for: a day-long outdoor block party celebrating the MAGA movement, and a rally to kick off the coming campaign season. On paper, Trump is deeply unpopular and trailing his potential opponents in key states.
Trump 2020!
But that's on paper. And as you know, Trump isn't one to believe what he reads. And he's got good reason not to. Last time, all the elites got it wrong, missing the intensity and the size of the Trump following. This time, it's on full display. Not only are the rallies like this one jam-packed, but the campaign says it raised almost $25 million from the faithful in just the last 24 hours. But mostly the confidence in Trump world isn't based on anything that's happening right now. It's based on what happened in 2016. They're still so amped by his out-of-nowhere win that it's almost like they just want to keep reliving it.
The people who funded the phony dossier, crooked Hillary Clinton, and the DNC.
Who would you most like to see President Trump take on?
Hillary again. I would love to see that again. Hillary and Michelle Obama. I would love to see that matchup. To me, that would be the greatest matchup, because then we can expose them totally one last time.
So what about the Democrats Trump is actually likely to face? The supporters here really aren't too worried about them either.
I think they're self-destructing. They're taking positions that are so far left that they've lost their party. Traditional Democrats don't follow them anymore. And all they have is a bunch of angry people who just hates everything.
They're all laughable. I mean, Mr. Biden is old and used up. The rest are a little crazy.
Is there anyone that you're worried could beat President Trump in the 2020 race?
No, not really, no.
In 2016, these folks learned a few critical lessons: that outsider swagger beats political polish, that the segment of Americans who deeply distrust Washington is way larger than the elites thought. But mostly they learned one thing: that polls can be wrong. Not just that they can be wrong, but that they're basically always wrong.
Let's go back 4 years to when, what's her name, was, Hillary. What happened to her? She was like smoking them.
You know how the polls went last time. Okay, they all said, no, he's no way he's going to win. It's never going to happen. You know, I don't believe in polls, to be honest. I think they're really fixed sometimes.
So is Trump's worldview right? Maybe. It might be impossible to measure public opinion accurately these days. Or it might be that Trump's 2016 win was a false positive, and that this time it's his side that could be undone by overconfidence. Recently, news outlets got a hold of internal polling from the Trump campaign that showed the president trailing badly. But Trump didn't change up his strategy. What did he do? He fired his pollsters.
President Trump awarded economist Arthur Laffer the Medal of Freedom today, making him the first person ever to win that honor for scribbling on a cocktail napkin. In 1974, Laffer had a drink with Dick Cheney, who was then President Gerald Ford's deputy chief of staff, and drew a sketch of what became known as the Laffer curve. The curve starts with two truisms. One, if the income tax rate is 0%, the government collects no tax revenue. And two, if the income tax rate is 100%, the government also collects no tax revenue, since no one will bother to work. Laffer put those 2 points on a graph and then drew a curve between them. The idea behind the curve is easy to understand. As income tax rates rise, so does the amount of money the government collects. But at some point, people have less of an incentive to work or start a business, since they get to keep less of their income. So when tax rates rise beyond that point, tax revenue actually begins to fall. The implication is that there's an optimal rate that maximizes the amount of tax revenue the government can collect. It also means that in some circumstances, you can cut taxes and actually raise tax revenues. Now, the only way to know whether a tax cut actually will increase tax revenue is to figure out what the optimal rate is. If it's low, the curve looks like this, and as tax rates go down, revenue goes up. If it's high, which most economists believe it to be, the curve looks like this, and as tax rates go up, revenue does too. Laffer himself, though, didn't really bother with trying to figure out the shape of the curve. He just made it symmetrical and said that the US was on the wrong side of it. This was music to the ears of conservatives. They seized on Laffer's idea and, with his help, made it even catchier. Tax cuts would pay for themselves. Americans could eat their cake and have it too. Cut taxes and still pay for government programs without increasing the deficit. The Laffer curve became the justification for the Reagan tax cuts, which over 5 years slashed the top income tax rate from 70% to 28%. It was the justification for massive tax cuts in Kansas in 2012, and it was trotted out again to help rationalize Trump's massive tax cut. The only problem is that none of it was true. The Reagan tax cuts didn't pay for themselves. They cut tax revenues by 13%. Kansas's tax cuts reduced state tax revenue by almost $700 million, forcing steep cuts to government services. And the Trump cuts decreased corporate tax revenue by almost $100 billion last year, even though corporate profits were up. As a result of all these cuts, no one can doubt that we're now well below the optimal tax rate. So the Laffer curve is telling us today that the way to raise revenue is to raise taxes. But good luck getting a Medal of Freedom for that idea.
Okay.
Damien Bellin is used to doctors. Damien has hepatitis C, a chronic liver disease spread through blood. He got it from his mom. He was 12 when he found out.
It's like a little shadow that's behind you, and you don't know how to tell people.
Hep C is quietly the most widespread infectious disease in the US, affecting more than 2 million people. And because it's easily spread through shared needles, the opioid epidemic means it's getting worse.
How's it going? Good to see you.
I'm gonna go over your last labs. But first, how are you doing?
Doing good.
Yeah? How's life?
Working hard, you know, slinging those drinks.
So the reason I gotta treat and cure you as soon as possible.
Absolutely.
You gotta enjoy those drinks as much as possible.
Damien's doctor, Jason Halperin, is an expert in infectious disease. He sees patients 5 times a week at a clinic.
How urgent is the Hep C crisis in this country?
It's incredibly urgent. People die of Hep C more than any other infection that exists in the United States. Let it be HIV, TB, influenza. So it is of urgent need to treat and cure.
When Damien was diagnosed, there was no cure. But in 2014, the pharmaceutical company Gilead released a groundbreaking drug.
It's the one and only cure. That's one pill once a day for 12 weeks.
Only Damien can't get it because he's not sick enough.
So here is the letter, January 22nd, 2019.
Denial notice.
It has many, many pages,
Okay.
But the only thing that really matters is this first sentence. An United Healthcare Community Plan will not pay for the care.
The medication is so expensive, Medicaid has had to ration the pill, treating only people whose livers are already damaged by Hep C. Or he could pay out of pocket, with a price tag of $91,000. It's the Louisiana Health Department, with its strapped state budget, making the decisions on who gets treatment. But Dr. Rebecca Gee, the state secretary of health, thinks the disease can be eliminated entirely, and she's been trying for 3 years to get a better deal.
Here we have a cure for an infectious disease. This should be a solvable problem, but it's not because the drug is too expensive.
So she got creative. She dug up an obscure 1910 law that gives the federal government the right to use any patent as long as it pays the holder a reasonable price.
So you considered taking away the patent from the Hep C makers?
Well, we asked the question. Not surprisingly, the pharmaceutical industry was less than enthusiastic
Sure.
about this idea. So we said, okay, what else?
This time, Gee would negotiate with pharma, but change the terms. For one set price, she'd get unlimited drugs for people on Medicaid and in prisons.
What we came up with, why don't we spend the current price up to a cap that we pre-negotiate, so that's our subscription price, and then after that price, we get rebated back 100% of our spend.
The pricing scheme worked in Australia in 2015. Since Louisiana suggested the idea, Washington State has also followed suit.
How much did Medicaid spend on the Hep C cure last year?
So last year we spent around $30 million.
$30 million.
Mhm.
How many people were you able to treat?
About 300.
But let's say you had the subscription model. How many people could you treat?
Our goal would be 10,000 people next year.
All 3 manufacturers of Hep C drugs responded to the state's request for proposals. She's been in talks with Gilead to settle on a price for the generic version of their drug, Epclusa.
It really wasn't until there was more competition in the market that we were able to get some traction.
What's it like to negotiate with a company like Gilead? What power do you have to really negotiate with them?
Yeah, I mean, we have the power of our state spend on drug pricing, but it really is a David and Goliath, and we are David. Any negotiation, if you can't say no, it's not really truly a negotiation.
The deal should be a win-win. Sales of Hep C meds are down, and this contract would lock in a market for 5 years. Still, the June 1st target date to get an agreement came and went.
The for-profit drug industry is extremely difficult to change because they're for-profit, they have shareholders, and those shareholders want to make money.
you're not offering up enough money? Is that what's happening?
Well, we just don't have it. And what would I say to somebody who says, well, it's just not fair that you're not treating everyone? I would say to them, it would cost me $750 million to treat everyone in Medicaid, and that would take away my K through 12 budget. I mean, what do I do? You tell me.
This week, Dr. Gee and the health department finally broke through with Gilead and reached a deal. It isn't everything Dr. Gee hoped. Louisiana is paying a lot more than they did last year. But starting July 15th, the state will have unlimited access to the cure for 5 years, and a big incentive to treat as many people as they can.
Gilead goes through with the deal. Aren't Gilead the people that created this problem?
Yes, the fault is on the drug companies because they're pricing so high, but mostly I blame policymakers because it's our policies that allow these drugs to be so high. This model is an example of a voluntary agreement, one where a company and a state agree to, without having to regulate it.
We asked Gilead if the company bears any responsibility for making the drug so expensive, and they did not respond to our question.
What does it tell you about the landscape of the negotiation market that even though you have all this support, you still can't fully force the prescription drug companies to play ball?
Yeah, I mean, the rules are stacked against us. The idea is, pharma, why should you care, right? So right now, we give you this money and we get restricted access. Why do you care if we're gonna treat someone who costs you dollars a pill? Why does it matter to you if we're gonna treat someone in Medicaid who's not getting treated? Or if we're gonna treat someone in jail, you'll never make that money.
Yeah.
So what is it to you that we treat them and we save their life?